Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Erasmus Expedition. I just saw a message pop up that's saying that Hangouts is going away later this year. Great. Nice of them to acknowledge that as I go live. So anyways, welcome back to the Erasmus Expeditions. This is going to be episode 13 of the channel, or the series called Help Action. And tonight we're going to be talking about creating compelling characters. Now, for those of you who are new, this is a show that is kind of one part interview, one part topic discussion, one part Q&A. So if you are sticking around in the chat and joining us tonight, then go ahead and throw us some questions in the chat so that we can get to them as this goes on. So I am welcoming a person who is a good friend of mine. Actually, he plays in one of my campaigns on this channel, and I happen to have met him in real life, which is very awesome. So, Josh, you son of a bitch, how are you?
Man, I'm doing fantastic after the week that I had. I'm doing really well. I'm blessed to be in recovery as I am.
Yeah, man, it sounded hellish.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. I'm doing all right. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I'm glad you're hanging in there. Glad you're recovering. So, what to talk about before we get rolling here, if anything? We were just talking about the recent announcement that Disney has decided to re-release the Avengers Endgame, literally a movie that's been out of the theaters maybe 6 weeks, with new footage.
I didn't even think it was out of the theaters yet, honestly.
Right? So it'll probably have 10 extra seconds of Robert Downey Jr. jokes or something. But anyways, so yeah, that was an interesting thing that I learned right before we started the show.
I think the more interesting thing that you learned is that Google Hangouts is going to be going away, like as you were launching.
Yeah, that's a brilliant stroke. Another brilliant stroke by Google. Their handling of this whole fiasco.
Now what are we going to do?
I don't know. Pay money to somebody. It's going to stop being free. That's what it's going to happen. Okay, cool. So like I said, we're talking tonight about compelling characters and kind of creating them for RPGs. So one of the questions that I like to kind of lead with is to ask my guests, when and how did you find gaming? How did you get into the hobby?
Are you talking strictly tabletop?
Or whatever led to that?
Yeah.
Gateway drug.
I mean, I've been playing games, since the dawn of my existence, basically. But tabletop gaming for me really didn't come along until I think the year was 2015. I had a good friend, Chris Miller, introduced me to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, me and my wife. She had played once before, but it was my first intro into the hobby, and I quickly fell in love with my first character, and the freedom and the excitement from the stories we got to be able to tell with each other. It caught fire pretty quick, and from there on, I got into GMing myself, and I GM a lot now at home, but I like to play a lot. It's pretty crazy how quickly it caught fire for me. I really loved it.
Yeah, it sounds like you haven't been doing it for maybe 4 years, 5 years.
Just about. I mean, summer 2015.
Yeah, wow, that's really awesome. So you said you were into games and stuff, other games, before you got into tabletop gaming. So you're talking about like video games?
Yeah, video games a lot since I was young, but I mean also like collectible card games and stuff like that.
Nice.
The only facet I think I haven't played like tabletop we're talking is like wargaming. I've never done any serious wargaming or anything. That's about it.
That's an expensive hobby.
Yeah, it's one I don't have the funds for.
Yeah, me either. Thankfully, I do miniatures and terrain for my D&D games, but I limit myself to that only because, yeah, I've seen down the slippery slope, and I don't I don't want to start down it.
Yeah, I hear you. I do minis and like a dry erase board at the house for my games. Mm-hmm. I do a lot of theater of the mind, but I like for everybody to be able to like at least be able to imagine where their characters are just a little bit. I'm not like a huge like let's pull out the ruler and measure where everybody's at and make sure.
Yeah, my home group is very, very tactical. We play
Okay.
combat really strategic, so we use a lot of gridded stuff. We draw everything out on the when it's an actual combat, we draw it out on the dry erase or the wet erase vinyl mat that we have, or we have terrain pieces that we put down and stuff. So, and almost everybody has a miniature that at least like stands in for them.
Yeah.
So it's, I don't know, it's a different way of playing. I like it. I love it actually. But it's very different than the kind of play that I'm able to accomplish online.
Right. I mean, obviously. Well, I mean,
Right.
nowadays they got stuff like Roll20 and stuff that'll let you put all that stuff up on the board, and you can play a more tactical game online. It's just, I guess, probably a lot more planning and
Yeah, it's a lot of upfront work.
a lot of legwork. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I really like. I think it's taught me a lot mechanically about the game. Playing a game that's that strategic. I think that has a lot to do with why I'm as comfortable with the rules of 5e as I am, because I've been playing that way for a long time.
Yeah.
So,
I hear you there.
but that's awesome, dude. So do you think that like having a background in video games and like trading card games and things like that, do you think that has changed your approach to the game to, say, somebody who grew up watching fantasy movies or reading fantasy books?
Yes, because and I was just thinking about this too. It's because back in the day when I used to play video games, like role-playing video games, games that were based on tabletop gaming, like Morrowind is obviously like a tabletop, into a video game. There's no tabletop for it, but you can tell that that's what they had in mind when they were making it. But like games like that, I used to think, and I was like, man, I would make these characters and I would just come up with the backstory and all that stuff. Like in Oblivion, especially, they have a mod called Live Your Own Life or something like that, Live Another Life, where basically instead of starting at the beginning of the game, they gave you like 20 different options to start, and you could like start your story from those points instead, where it's not like, okay, you're the hero of the game, go do the main quest. And this is like, no, you're like a dock worker, and now you're getting treated unfairly in this town, so what are you going to do about it? Stuff like that. But I used to make these characters, and I'm like, I had a really deep love for them. But the thing with video games is that and it gets better every year with all these new games coming out, is they have certain parameters that you have to be confounded, and that's where my love for tabletop comes from. It's because they don't have those parameters. I mean, they have rules, but it's a lot more free form, and you can do pretty much whatever you want. So like, I came from that basically. It started with the MMOs and the role playing games of my childhood, and then I was like, man, it'd be really cool if instead of doing this, I could do this, but I know they haven't programmed it that way, or there's no way to do that. So learning that I could, whenever somebody pitched me Dungeons and Dragons, like, yeah, you could do whatever you want, really. I was like, really? Okay, let's let me dive in. Let me figure out what's going on in here.
Yeah, and I've also found a lot of people who I know came from video gaming first. They tend to have a little bit, not always, but a little bit more of an issue like releasing the spotlight, like sharing, because they're so used to being the character that's doing everything in the story. Yeah. So it's an issue that I've noticed with some younger players, but you're definitely not one of them. Not in my experience. And it's just something that I think a lot of people have to kind of get out of the mindset of a little bit. I think that's where what happens in role-playing games is vastly different from what happens in video games. I think that's one of the biggest things that separates the two.
There's not one main character. There's a party of main characters.
Yeah. You have to understand where your part in that group is,
right,
and be that part consistently. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Well, we're already talking about characters and things anyways, so why don't we go ahead and hop to the first talking point that I have, which is when you put a character to paper, it's a task that's often full of a lot of choices. Kind of what they look like, what they're going to wield in combat, what they may excel at, what they're going to carry with them whenever they go on their adventures. And this is usually enough to make a character perfectly playable. But is there more that is needed to create what you would consider to be a compelling character?
Yes. I like to think about basically everything. Like, you got the stats on the board, you know, you got all the dice, you got all the stats. You could play that character all day long, but is it really fulfilling for anybody to play the character? I don't feel like you would have a connection with that character because you don't know about that character. You might know what what their dexterity score is, but you don't know, what happened in their past that forced them to be who they are, really, or what's going to happen with this party to make them be who they are. So I feel like, yeah, you can play those characters, but they're not compelling characters, at least not for me. But that's just, everybody's got their own personal preference. But I like a character with a bit more depth.
Yeah, it's one of those things where if you want to have a story that is more enriching, if you want to have one that's more emotionally true to real life, then your characters have to ring that way. They have to come across as real people,
Yes.
with three dimensions. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, if you want to have a character who is the kind of character that's going to pull emotion at the table, when something bad happens to them, not only you feel sad, but everybody feels sad. Or whenever they have a triumph, everybody wants to celebrate with you because they've fallen in love with your character. If you want to have that kind of character, then you have to make them more than just what's on the page.
Yeah, you have to pull that, make them as real as possible for me, as relatable as possible, especially.
Yeah, I agree. Are there any kinds of tips or tricks that you can kind of think of that would utilize someone to generate a more satisfying and realistic character?
I think everybody's kind of gone through this one, and anybody in the medium or in the hobby knows, like, looking at your favorite characters from your favorite movies or your favorite books or video games and pulling the things that you like to put on the docket for your character, basically. Like, okay, yeah, this character's great, but what was their backstory like? Okay, he's a rogue or an orphan. They got the Batman. Yeah, everybody's done it once or twice. Well, who cares? But that's just that's the thing that I do to help pull those snippets of things that I like from other characters' stories, and I use those to kind of make a mishmash of something that's pseudo original, but not really original, because what's really original, everything's just you're really just pulling out of everything, honestly. But yeah, that's how I do it. Another thing that I like to do is when I start making a character, the very first thing that I do is find like nice evocative art for it, or like maybe like a song or something like that, like imagining a scene with this character. Okay, now I know who this character is. I have a real good understanding of who they are in this scene or in this picture or in this moment, and now I can define who they are elsewhere.
I think it's important, and I think most people nowadays are so inundated with stories. You can catch them anywhere, from a book, comic book, television, movie, whatever, you name it. And like you said, there's not an original story to be told. So there's certain tropes and cliches, character archetypes, plot lines, things like that are recognizable. And sometimes, even if you don't recognize it on a conscious level, there's a part of your subconscious that understands what the story is and where things are going to be going if it continues on the normal arc that it's recognizing. That's how you know when a story feels weird or feels off. Like, I thought it was going to go this way, and then it didn't, and I don't know, I didn't like that. It's usually unsettling because it doesn't fulfill this arc that you're used to. Now, if you're going to have an I just completely lost my train of thought. If you're going to have a character that has a complicated arc, yeah, I'm not recovering that at all. Getting old sucks.
Doesn't it?
Sucks a lot. Well, I assure you, it was prophecy.
A grand thought, I'm sure.
What was I saying? What the hell? Tips or tricks? Yes, art. Art is a huge one for me. Finding a good character portrait is enormous.
It's my biggest one.
One of the things that I love to do is to bring the picture up and just sit and stare at the character's eyes for a little while. Almost like you're looking in a mirror is almost kind of the way you would treat the exercise, if you will. And just stare and think about looking at your reflection in the mirror. And eventually, like, you start, if it's a good portrait especially, you'll start to get what their persona is like, what their voice might sound like, the way they carry themselves. All of this kind of information you start leeching all of that off of the information that's given to you in the portrait. And because your brain is connecting to these arcs that it recognizes, these archetypes. And it's like, oh, this looks like the guy from that Robin Hood movie. Oh, I loved him. He was such a jerk, but he was this guy that had like a heart of gold. So, okay, that's the character type that I'm playing.
And that's genius, man. I never thought of it like that, but just listening to you describe it, I know doing it myself would be successful. That's beautiful.
Yeah, I like that kind of stuff because then I feel like the character is informed and it's based on something that has worked in the past. It caught my attention, and it's something I've remembered. So it's something that's probably good. And then I'll take pieces of other things and kind of weave it in where it feels like it can flesh out and be like a different character.
I think something you could do, like with that portrait you were talking about, if you could focus enough on the portrait to forget about what is around you, or like just to forget about yourself, you start to forget about who you are as a person and start to think about who they are as a person. It helps you kind of step into their shoes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Turn off the lights, put some music on, just stare at the screen for just, 5 minutes, maybe, if you can do it that long. But I think you'll find that ideas will start coming to you.
Yeah, it's genius, man.
Yeah. And it's insightful. And along the same lines of like what I've started doing with the campaigns, like sending the questions ahead of time. I feel like those really help people dig deep into things of their character that they wouldn't normally think of. Not just, whether their parents are still alive, or, whether somebody wants them for money, or, they were a failed soldier. It goes into deeper aspects than that. And it forces you to think in a lot of different directions at once with the character.
Can tell a lot from somebody's eyes. Windows to the soul.
Awesome. So, moving right along, how important are flaws and weaknesses to a character's overall appeal?
Like I said in the last, I think that for everybody it's going to vary, but for me, it's very important because when those come out and play, that's where the magic happens with role play to me. Like whenever something, like if my character's flaws that I'm going to use something we were just talking about, roll up and die. Shout out AppTab. I'm going to use one that I heard from their podcast a long time ago, and but something like this. Well, your character's family was killed by werewolves, and you encounter werewolves with the party, and okay, now you're fighting, and it comes to your turn, and you don't have any disadvantages or anything, but my character is not going to attack a werewolf. He's going to be petrified for this turn. I'm just going to say, outright, he doesn't do anything. There's nothing he can do. His entire family was, so stuff like that. When those come up, that's when the magic happens in roleplay for me. Because after the combat, your party comes along and they're like, "Hey, what happened there?" You're normally the most competent fighter in the group, and all of a sudden, it's like you were looking at your worst nightmare. And then you get the exposition or the backstory comes out, and all that good stuff. They're very important for me, and I don't think that it should take front and center all the time. But I think that you should have a couple of them that are easily enough accessible, or easily enough easily enough accessible that you think that they will come up in game, at least like once, one time as a big reveal, like 2 or 3 of those, to be able to have those kind of moments.
Yeah, I think that's why it's a really good idea to work with your GM on kind of establishing those. So that way your GM knows that, one, they're important to you, and two, it gives them, like, a good GM is going to understand that that's ripe material to draw from.
Oh yeah.
And if you have that kind of stuff given to you from a player,
Like
even
gold.
if it might be, a 200-page essay or whatever, if you manage to read it, incorporate as much of it as you can. Because that's the kind of stuff that's going to draw really good reactions out of your players. Yeah, and I think flaws and weaknesses for me are possibly even more important than the strengths and achievements of a character.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I feel like without the flaw, you can't have these great successes. Because if everybody's just great successes all the time, then where did they come from? Where's the development there?
Yeah. There's a lot of different quotes that go something to the effect of, success is built on failures.
Right.
It's not just a shot in the dark that you got good at wielding a sword. There were times where you were humiliated, where you were put on your ass by someone who was far more experienced than you. You may have even learned your lesson the hard way, and you have scars to show it. Maybe you're missing a hand. Play a character with a literal handicap. It may teach you a lot about how important, where to put the priorities of the kind of characters that you want to play. And I think that's, I have it in the notes here, and I know I'm going to catch a lot of shit for it, but like, that's one of the reasons to me why Superman is not an interesting character. Like, I think it's one of the reasons why most of his films, at least contemporary, don't do well. I think he only has, really 2 weaknesses, Kryptonite and Lois Lane. And you can only kind of hit those notes so many times before the stories become very redundant.
Yeah. I think that has a lot to do with the era in which Superman was created, because times were a lot simpler back then, I think. And, stereotypes were different, all that good stuff. Like, nobody really cared about, what made the hero weak. They just wanted to see the hero beat the crap out of the villains all the time. But in the year 2019, things are a whole lot different. People care a whole lot about, what makes them crack or what makes them weak and why. Or, yeah, that's why they're strong, but they're strong because they are weak and they came from their weakness to overcome it and become strong. Those are some heavily touched on plot points in the future. Well, in our time now, but I don't think they were as relevant back then, honestly.
Yeah, I think that absolutely agrees. I think that is absolutely on point, and it's definitely a sign of the times. Like you said, priorities were different. Stereotypes were different. They change over time. What is appealing, and I think it's probably a good thing. But I think if you're looking to play a character who is flawless, personally, I think you're missing out.
Oh yeah.
I think it sounds awesome to be the guy who can do everything, and has no worries or real concerns. But I think that would, for me, I know it would lose its appeal very, very fast.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I think, especially in a D&D game, like your character being the immortal badass who's just the ass kicker of the century, who just comes around and is the best at everything. Like, you're detracting from your party. Your party has no chance to shine, and you're just hogging the spotlight. Or, and success is great, but if like I said earlier, if you're succeeding all the time, then it loses some of the value. Like, if you're failing and you succeed when it really counts, that's I would take one of those over 100. Just kind of brush off successes.
Yeah, and I think that has to do with quantity. I think the more you succeed at something, the less of a surprise it is when you do succeed. there's no feeling of value to it. It's been
Right.
cheapened. And I think even beyond that, I think having flaws makes a character more relatable, because we as humans don't have perfection amongst us. I hate to break it to you. Everybody has shit that they have to deal with and things about themselves that they may not be pleased in. But that's kind of what makes us relatable as humans. That's what makes characters in media, when you see them flawed and vulnerable, you form a stronger connection with them. You care about them more.
Yes.
Because you identify situations or problems with these people. And especially in a game like Dungeons and Dragons, where the characters, or even like a superhero game, where the characters are so extraordinary, they're beyond our understanding of physics, mental capabilities, strength, all of these things, that it can be difficult to get into their headspace. And I think by giving them very human, very real flaws, which, by the way, is the only way to tell a good Superman story, is to show their humanity, to draw out what makes them less extraordinary, what humanizes the extraordinary. I think that's a key that a lot of the players who we're kind of discussing seem to miss out on.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And the other point that I wanted to bring up is internal struggle. Not only just having a flaw, but having an internal struggle, something that is current, that you're currently having to deal with. And it may not even be something that is outward in any way. It could be a complete secret. But if you as a player understand that they're going through this internal struggle, I think it can be an incredibly strong source of motivation, and it can give you a definitive direction to go whenever you're confronted with certain situations in certain scenes.
Yeah, I agree with that. Most of my characters have the inner turmoil. My character that I play in Banners has inner turmoil like out the wazoo. He's got a lot of problems, but a lot of times they don't show themselves. But when they do show themselves, it creates those role-playing opportunities I talked about, especially with like Karen's character and Baron's character. Because they're good friends of Eddard. Not to say that everybody else isn't now, but back in the day, whenever they were just forming up. Yeah, that inner turmoil is a heavily touched on subject for me. Like if flaws are up there for me, the inner turmoil thing is definitely up there too. It's a flaw.
Yeah, and I think it's what you said earlier too. Like, it's not something you'd want to do all of the time, because it could lessen its appeal over time. But having that be in your your tool belt,
it's just a seed, really. Like, it's there,
mm-hmm.
and something's going to trigger it later on down the line. But nobody knows, but and that's all that matters, because when it happens, it's going to be spectacular. People are going to, they're going to open their eyes wide, because what happened? Like, he was all calm, cool, and collected for 6 sessions, and then, something happened, and now he's a mess. He's a whole different person now.
Yeah. And yeah, I absolutely love when those kinds of scenes just unfold, and they weren't necessarily intentional. Sometimes they might even like sideline something that's going on, but it's absolutely worth it usually to take that tangent and let it play out, because it turns into some phenomenal role playing usually, and almost always it ends up strengthening the story and giving you more stuff to use and play with later on.
Might be better than what was coming.
Absolutely. Oftentimes.
It happens a lot. I understand.
Yeah. Okay. So some players resist and rail against harm, consequences, or trouble being thrown their character's way. Unless, of course, it can be beaten with might or magic. So how open to DM intrusion do you think a player should be regarding their character's personal story?
So By DM intrusion, you're meaning like if I give you a hook in my background, like here's this, one-off NPC that I used to see and now I don't see them anymore and I miss that relationship. And then all of a sudden that NPC is walking around in the town. Is that what kind of intrusion you're talking about? Just role play intrusion?
Yeah, like that. Or taking liberties with things that you have mentioned in your backstory or
like I was wanted in this town. Now, suddenly the DM's got guards knocking at the tavern, like looking for me.
Right. Or like in to go back to Beneath the Banner Shadow, finding out that the parents that had raised you were not actually your character's parents. That kind of stuff. Yeah. Some people get really, really, really kind of iffy about that kind of stuff. So what is your view on the whole thing?
When that happened and we figured out that whole twist, it was beautiful because that's my thing. I love to have like a little blurb, a little background, and put it into the hands of the GM and say, you do with it what you want, because that's less. I don't want to say it's less that I have to do as a player, but sometimes people have better ideas than you. Oftentimes, people have better ideas than me, and so I would have never thought that for my character. If I were to pick all the surprises and twists that were going to come in my character's life, I would have never picked that. So that's why I do that, and I think people should be open to the DM intrusion. If you have enough want to put it in the material that you give the GM to work with, then you should be ready to deal with the repercussions that follow. And I think that also comes down with the trusting your GM and stuff. So you got to know who you're playing with. Obviously, playing with you, I know who I'm playing with, and playing with my home group. And Chris sometimes DMs for us when I'm not feeling up for DMing. I know what Chris is like, and I trust Chris, and I trust you. And you just gotta. It's a certain level of it's an entry fee basically to one to put up, for that kind of a backstory. If you're not trusted you GM so much, you don't give them that much stuff to work with. It's not a big deal. Maybe you're not gonna have like such a role play heavy game. Maybe the game will be more like traditional, go in the dungeon and come out with a treasure or whatever. But that's the game I like to play. I like to play the role play game. So I put it in your hands. I put it in Chris's hands. I put it in whoever's hands, and I'm like, look, do with that information what you will. Surprise me, because that also kind of it strengthens your ability to improvise a little bit, because I didn't know what I was going to do whenever I found out that my character's parents weren't his real parents, or maybe they are his real parents, but he's got this lineage, and I was like, okay, what do I do now? And it gets the gears turning. It's healthy for your improvisation skills.
Yeah, I think nothing will sharpen them faster than reaction. Yeah, absolutely. You have to get that reaction time, down fast, or you have to sit and think about it for a moment, and that's not a bad thing. A lot of players tend to kind of think that that's oh no, I don't know what to do, or I don't know what to say, but that's perfect, because maybe your character doesn't know what to say yet.
Exactly.
So role play the confusion, role play the stumbling in the dark and trying to figure it out, grasping at any clue that they can possibly find. That's okay. That's good.
It's those moments, if you say that, or if you like play it down and you don't know what to do in the moment, but you play it down, those moments won't be as impactful as if you say that your character doesn't know what to think right now, or like he's just visibly stunned. And then later on you have another character come along and say, hey, what happened back there? And then that scene happens again. And it's just it's a good scene. And I think you'll always get more out of that, more out of pushing it along than you will from rushing it.
Absolutely. And I think you'll have a much better chance of seeding it well in the established character. It's something that makes sense for them as a character that you've kind of built thus far. And if it doesn't entirely make sense within their character, then all of a sudden their character's been fractured, if you will, and now this is a place for you to take it in a different direction for some reason. There's been a change, a fundamental shift in them, and that's something that you can roleplay the hell out of.
Yeah, I agree with that. My character, in Banners didn't go anywhere that I planned him to go. He started out one way, and with all the with the events, with the personal events and the party events and all the backstory, that it just all takes it in a different direction, and it could go a different direction next time we play. Like something could happen and change everything. But that's where the enjoyment for tabletop comes from, for me anyway.
Yeah, I love the fact that I can sit down with a story where I know where it's going, or at least have a general idea of where it's going, and by the end of the session, it's different enough, if not entirely different, for me to just constantly be worrying with new ideas about where it could go next and what it might all mean. And I like that. It gives you a little bit of a high. That's not easy to find anywhere else, in my experience. Awesome. So, talking about that very thing, character growth is something that is cited a lot in other media, movies, television, books, etc. Many players tend to come to an idea with a fixed notion of who their character is already and who they hope that they might become. So I think I know your answer, but is it better to have this kind of approach, or do you think it's better to allow the events of the story to shape your character in an unexpected way, like we just mentioned?
So, yeah, I mean, my answer basically falls on 75% of the latter. I think it's good to come to the table with an idea of where your character's going, but I don't think you should ever hold on to anything past that. It should be completely malleable as far as I'm concerned, because like everything could just be thrown out the window next session, and that's fine. That's perfect for me anyway. But yeah, like that's one of the reasons I love tabletop so much. Nothing is finite. Anything can happen, and that's kind of one of the things that keeps me playing. But yeah, I would fall on that side for sure. Definitely come with something, but be prepared for it to change.
Yeah, and I think there's certain things that you should be okay with holding on to, with certain personality traits or moments that kind of they feel define them as a character, and hold on to those, but don't begrudge people wanting to change things a little here or there, especially if it involves things that kind of help you intertwine with other characters and the world and the setting. Those are moments that you should seek to create, if not be okay with allowing to happen.
Yeah.
And I think, like you said, leaving your character malleable is the best way that you can ensure that your character is going to achieve growth, that they're actually going to change, which is a good thing in a story. You want your character to change from the beginning to the end. Otherwise, they stay flat and uninteresting.
Right.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I have one other question that I wanted to ask you, and this one is directed more personally. So I know that you became a father at a fairly young age, and from my admittedly limited understanding of the situation, you wound up with custody of your son, which I'm going to add, in the South, is not an easy feat. My cousin went through something very, very similar with his daughter. It was a hard time in their life. Now, I'm certain that it was also a trying time for you to go through. I know that from the trying times in my own life, that though they have afforded me a different perspective on life in general, and also on me as who I am as a person. So, do you feel that these events involving your son and the time that kind of happened after, do you feel like that has given you more depth and complexity as a character, if you will?
Yes, absolutely. Because, and this is for anybody who ever watches this that might have known me before I had a son. I was not the best person in life, and I'm still not the best person today. But having kids changes you. You grow a lot. But yeah, I mean, just to think about who I was then and who I am now, that's tremendous growth for me as a character, as you would say. I have a lot of skills or traits that I might otherwise not have if that never happened to me. And yeah, it was a big deal for me, and it's a big deal every day. Honestly, I love my son.
Truth. I hear that, man. Being a parent is a wild, wild ride, and it's impossible to completely describe to someone who's never gone through it. But yeah, and I think that's a great way to illustrate exactly what we've been talking about. That allowing your character to change and grow with the things that are thrown at them that are beyond their control, that them adapting to their situation is an opportunity for them to gain more complexity, to become more realistic and more well-rounded as a human being.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. And to go back to the custody thing, like forming that or pushing that envelope with the hoops that you got to jump through for all that, certainly not easy, and certainly wouldn't have happened without my wife, who I was dating at the time. But so she pushed me to say, hey, this could be better than it is right now, and I know it's good now, but it could be way better. So that helped me, helped me form, even like two characters form a relationship. We formed more bonds over that, while we were still just dating, and that helped to strengthen our relationship as two characters, like you would say. And yeah, definitely something that would have taken a lot longer without her help.
Well, I'm glad that she was there to not only support you, but to push you in the direction that you ultimately the direction you wanted to go, which is a fantastic thing, not only for you and her, but also for your son, I think.
Yeah, sometimes you don't know where you're going until you get there. You're like, I wanted this the whole time. I didn't know it yet.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, life is going to throw things in front of you that you don't expect, or that challenge you. And sometimes when you're not ready, most of the time when you're not ready,
Yeah.
Life has a way of kind of kicking you in the nads when you're already on the ground. And sometimes all you can do is to just get back up and keep going and figure out how to go. Yeah, where do you go from there? And when you do that, you're becoming stronger. And I think the same can be said for RPG characters. Having them befall these flaws, these troubles and trials that they're thrown up against, especially maybe even when it feels like they're outmatched or that they're going to lose. Trust in the GM.
Yeah. I think that's definitely true, because when matched with insurmountable odds, sometimes magical stuff happens. Like crazy changes in your character will happen, or some stuff like that.
Yep, I agree.
Roadblocks make the best characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, I mean, you might remember the fight that you had with the ogre, 10 years later. But chances are more likely that you're going to remember this crazy culmination of a story that happened whenever everybody at the table cried.
Oh yeah.
There's still moments that I talk about that with my gaming group, and they come up far more frequently than, oh, do you remember the fight in the Storm Giant's castle? So yeah, I think there's a easier way to make characters that are meaningful, and through making meaningful characters, you end up making a much more meaningful game, I think.
More meaningful story, even.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had one question that came up in the chat, and it has to do with what we were talking about earlier on. And the question is from John Cook, and he says, do you think that video games and card games help you to see the underlying math and mechanics of an RPG?
I'm pretty good as far as math goes, at least on the level of tabletop. You know, I find the math to be pretty easy, at least for me. But I think that the card games in specific helped me to learn rules easier. D&D 5th edition is not a huge, hefty rule book or anything. So, but crunchier systems, definitely those times, counting mana or counting, energy for Pokemon or stuff like that, stuff like that will help me learn rules easier. I think it's because of the way, I don't know. I really don't know, to be honest, but I think that the two do have coinciding roots. So I think that learning those rules earlier helped me to be a better listener of the rules or learner of the rules later on down the road with tabletop. That's for sure.
Yeah. I would have a similar answer. I would say, because like I learned to play Magic the Gathering the same year that I started playing D&D. And I actually played Magic more regularly than I did Dungeons and Dragons early on. Because early on, I only played D&D like twice a year. So I got to play a Magic much more frequently. And I definitely know that the rules and the way that the mechanics and things work in Magic influenced my understanding of the rules for Dungeons and Dragons later on. Not so much the mathematics part of it, but certainly like the way different rules relate to one another and how this one rule could affect this other rule that seems different. But, if you understand the strategy of them being played together at different, kind of staggered in turn order, or, when they're paired together in one character, it's certainly attributed to me kind of grasping those kind of concepts. Video games, however, no, not math or mechanics at all.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that either.
Like,
there are some games.
Maybe.
There are some games like. There's not the problem with games like role-playing games where you want to see what's going on in the background is because they have that nice user interface with all the nice numbers that are arranged neatly. You don't see any of the math that goes on behind any of it, but if you know the math that goes on behind it, it would probably help you to understand D&D. Because like I played a couple of different games like Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, which is based on the tabletop game Vampire. It's literally from the book, but with this user interface to cover up all the ugly rules so that you don't have to look at them. It does the computing for you, basically. But yeah, I mean, knowing what goes on behind the curtain will help you to learn rules a little bit easier in D&D and have a better grasp of how better to do the math.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I would have to amend my statement because I did play Baldur's Gate, 1 and 2, and Neverwinter Nights 1 and 2, and those are based off of Dungeons and Dragons engines. And I would say that they probably influenced my understanding of the mechanics. I didn't usually turn on where it would show the calculations and that kind of stuff, but it certainly helped with my knowledge of the spells. The options that a fighter has at a certain level, those kinds of things. It certainly familiarized me with the rules. And I think other than that, the video games that I kind of grew up playing and were really fans of, I think it probably helped me inspire me more narratively than it does mechanically.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Video games are some video games can tell just some insane stories that will stick with me for the rest of my life. They're so good. It boggles my mind how these writers are able to come up with some of these things. But yeah, some video game stories and been better than movies and books for me at some points. Excellent writers working out there.
A lot of times too, you get to live the action. You're not
that too.
not imprinted on this, ingenue, who's way more attractive than you will ever be. You're usually looking at the back of somebody's head, or or you're looking through their eyes, and you're being able to kind of implant yourself on them and put yourself in the situation a lot more. And in most video games, you get to control what's happening in the situation.
Yeah, if somebody hands you the reins, it's a lot different. And speaking of that, have you ever played any of the Telltale games before they closed down, like The Walking Dead and stuff like that?
Yes. I'm trying to remember one of the first ones that they made. I think was one of the ones that I played, but I don't remember which one it was now. I played a little bit of The Walking Dead. I didn't play a little of The Walking Dead. Golly, I'm completely drawing a blank now. But I did play a little bit of The Walking Dead. Maybe. I slept a lot, and like I said, getting old sucks. So.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you, I played through the first season of the Walking Dead game. I think they have like 2 or 3 seasons out or whatever before they, eventually shut down. But playing through the first season of the Walking Dead game, it just had me in tears by the end of it. It was just, the way the story progressed and the consequences of your actions, and you're doing it. You're sitting right there in front of the TV, and it's all you. You really feel like you're a part of it. And the game. It's hard to talk about sometimes. Games are nuts when it comes to crafting a story that you feel like you're in. Like, the medium is so good for that. And I'm not going to say that I don't love movies or anything, but it's a lot easier for me to imagine myself inside of a video game than it is inside of a movie.
Yeah, I could see that for sure. And I think one of the things that you pointed out is probably a really good lesson to try to take into your RPGs, and that is the giving your player the chance to make a decision that is going to alter things, letting their choices change your expectations in your story.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge part of telling a story that really kind of grabs your players and pulls them in.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's like the classic, your party meets the big bad evil guy for the first time, and then the rogue walks up and one-shots him. Like, that's a huge, okay, you weren't expecting it to go down like that, but man, wow. It's like one of those wow moments. Like, I put those in front of my players all the time, because I'm, as I said, like, as a player with my backstories with my character being as malleable as they are, my story is completely malleable as far as it would make sense to be. And I put those kind of decisions in my players' hands a lot. So I think it goes both ways, player and GM. Makes for a more interesting story.
I agree. And again, it strengthens you to be able to adapt and change and work with what you're given, instead of always having to be nope, this is the way that it is. This is the way that it's going to stay. It helps your own growth outside of character. Awesome, man. Well, that's everything that I've got. So thank you a ton for coming on and doing this and being on the channel. So why don't you tell the people where they can find you, plug what you want, and we'll put a bow on it.
Alrighty. First off, thank you for inviting me on here to talk about my favorite part of character, or probably my favorite part of D&D is making these characters. But yeah, the only thing that I really want to plug is go on Jeremy's channel and watch Beneath the Banner Shadow if you haven't, because it's an amazing game that you all should watch. And if you want to find me on Twitter or YouTube, you can find me on YouTube at Roll the Bones. You can find me on Twitter at Roll the Bones TV. My name is Josh. But yeah, thanks again, Jeremy, for having me. It was a lot of fun. I don't do a lot of interview style chats, so it's definitely a good exercise for me to kind of open up the mind.
You hear that, everyone? This is an exclusive Josh Sanders interview. No, dude, it's absolutely my pleasure. I've enjoyed getting to know you through playing together online and having the chance to actually meet you and your lovely family in person. I take you to one of my favorite restaurants. So this was awesome. as soon as you mentioned that you wanted to come on the show and talk about something, the only thing that was left to hash out was what we were going to talk about. And I think this was a fantastic topic.
Yeah,
So,
I agree.
Excellent, man. Well, he mentioned the channel. You should be able to find that in the description of this video down below. Definitely go check him out. And like he said, if you liked what we talked about tonight, check out Beneath the Banner's Shadow right here on the Erasmus Expeditions, because there is plenty of what we talked about tonight that is in full practice in that game.
Yeah, it's true. A lot of compelling characters in that one.
Very much so. A lot of very twisted, inner turmoil-driven characters. So it's a lot of good fun, a lot of good stuff, and a lot of fun. So, but until next time, may your dice roll high and your snacks always be within reach.